Hello, my name is Andre O'Brien, and I'd like to talk to you today about multitasking. What is multitasking? Multitasking is when a person deals with more than one task at a time. Research shows that human beings are not really good at multitasking. In fact, we're pretty bad at it. Our brains are designed to only handle one task at a time. And whenever we take on more than one task at a time, we don't do those tasks well. So an article that I read by a Dr. Dillner, which is entitled, "Are People Who Think They Can Multitask Deluding Themselves?" Speaks to this very phenomenon where, for example, they use a driver who is also speaking on the phone. The research shows that the drivers who are conducting this kind of multitasking actually miss stop signs at a much higher frequency than those who are just driving. Obviously, that's not something we want. What this article suggests is that you don't try to do more than one task at a time. Instead, you can take 20 minutes from one task and do another task. So instead of trying to do two at a time, you do one, you do not drive. Let's take me for example. I like to play chess. I like to look at TED Talks. But even though I know that I'm not paying attention as clearly as I'd like, because the minute that I start focusing on the TED Talk, I start to miss out on time in chess. And I make mistakes. The minute that I'm really engaged in chess, I'm missing some kind of key point in the TED Talk conversation. So instead of trying to do both, let's look at TED Talk for 30, 40 minutes. Let's play chess. So that way, I'm fully engaged in each activity individually, and I'm getting the most out of each activity. This reminds me, this leads to the second article that I read, or the video that I watched on multitasking, which featured a Dr. Ali Matu, who also corroborates the idea that we are poor as human beings at multitasking. And what most people do, what they think they're doing is multitasking, they're actually doing something called task switching. Task switching is switching from one task very quickly. So as opposed to the last resource which says do it for 20 minutes, task switching is I'm going from the TED Talk and then I'm playing chess, and then I'm going to the TED Talk and then I'm playing chess. And again, Dr. Ali Matu says that we don't do this very well. As a matter of fact, we do it poorly. What the brain requires, according to Dr. Ali, is an opportunity for, let's call it the daydream mode. Now, the daydream mode is when you don't have any kind of focused thinking. You're just letting your mind drift, and you're letting your mind just kind of wander and go elsewhere. And you do this for however long, let's say 20 minutes. When you come back to the activity, you should be fresher, you should be more engaged. However, if you're switching from one idea to another idea, from one activity to another activity, you're not allowing your brain that time to daydream and to process this information. Now, Carey, in chapter 7, I believe, gives an account of this phenomenon when he talks about a writer, novelist Joseph Heller. Now, Joseph Heller said, listen, my ideas don't come while I'm writing. My ideas come when I'm walking the dog, when I'm catching the bus, and just as I'm going to bed. Pretty much automatic processes. Going back to the video, Dr. Ali states that there are times when you are doing something that you have great familiarity with and it's almost automatic, such as driving to work, where you can listen to music and do both relatively well. However, when one of those activities becomes complex, such as driving in an area that you're not familiar with, you're going to have to turn that music off. Or you're learning a new song, you're going to start to miss some of the things on the road. So all this ties into the idea that the brain should be focused on one activity at a time, and the brain requires a period of rest where you are removed from the activity in order to digest the information, to process the information, and for the subconscious to spit out whatever new ideas, whatever dreams may come. This reminds me of last year dealing with one of my students. And it's so interesting Excuse me, that's my 5-minute alarm, but I'm going to go a little over 5 minutes. It's very interesting because when I looked at the article, Neuroscience for Educators, I was tempted to use the other article that you provided. However, there was something that I read in here that was that touched my heart, and it speaks directly to my experience with the student that I had last year. So, this article features a number of interviews that were conducted with a number of teachers, in terms of after they viewed like a conference or something where they learned a lot about the neuroscience, and how the brain learns and these things. Did they value that information? Did they think that information would be helpful in the classroom? And one teacher recounted, stated that because they learned about the plasticity of the brain, plasticity being how easily the brain changes over time. And we all know that children have a greater level of plasticity than adults. This teacher felt that understanding the plasticity of the brain gave them hope that their kids could learn. And to be honest, that's one of the greatest lessons that any teacher can have. Just so I don't go really over time. That's one of the greatest lessons that any teacher can have, because with this student, she routinely became super frustrated whenever she ran out of time to do an assignment or whenever an assignment became too rough. And eventually we got to the point where we created a card system so that when she felt overwhelmed, she could put the card up and then she could relax. She can go over to the fairy hut that my co-teacher created in the corner. She could read a book and she could come back when she was ready. That was a good system, but we found that when she switched from the activity, be it math or language arts, and she went to read, which is another focused activity, even if it's a book that she was familiar with, she either couldn't stay focused on the book or she became distracted by the class. Now, the class in general wasn't particularly loud, but because she couldn't focus on a book that she knew inside and out, she attributed that lack of focus to distractions. When in reality, now I understand that lack of focus is because she was switching from one activity which required focused attention to another activity which required focused attention. She wasn't getting into that daydream mode which would have relaxed her and giving her an energized sense to be able to go back to the math or language arts or whatever we were doing activity to alleviate some of that frustration. So the thing that we were doing was actually contributing to her frustration. I wish I would have known this last year. If only as educators did we understand the link between neuroscience and learning. It's something as simple as, instead of sending her off to read, won't you go, there were times where we do things called brain breaks. And during the brain break, they'd dance. They'd sing a song. These are two almost automatic things that we do, particularly dancing, because that's more muscle memory. We're not even really thinking when it comes to muscle memory, right? So, of course, when we get off of the brain break and they stop dancing, they can get back to the activity and they're refreshed because they've completely removed themselves from the focused attention mode. And while I wouldn't necessarily call it dancing daydreaming, but it is far less complicated. The complication, the difficulty of dancing and singing during the brain break is far lower than actually trying to learn a concept that probably was frustrating at this point. It is integral and important for teachers to understand the plasticity of the brain, to understand how different brain structures lend themselves to learning math easier, learning science easier. This even reminded me of a interview that a guy by the name of Brother Polite conducted. And during this interview, he talked about how more tonal languages lends itself to higher brain development. So he talked about the languages that had that clicking sound, those tonal sounds, and how those sounds, when spoken, actually wire the left and right hemispheres together. So he alluded to the idea that the left and the right hemisphere are working in concert, right? So that made me do some research. Now, mind you, that interview I watched was in 2016. So it made me do some research, and I found a site called language.com, and it talks about how tonal languages use both sides of the brain. And they conducted an experiment where they observed what parts of the brain were excited during speech. So it was English speech and Mandarin speech. And they found out that those who spoke English, the left side of the brain on fire. But those who spoke Mandarin, both sides of the brain were fire. So we're not dealing with just logic, we're dealing with creativity, ingenuity, music, arts. These are things that educators need to know. These are things, I think we stumble upon these things when we have our kids speaking languages such as Spanish, such as French, even Latin when I was young. These are more tonal languages that elicit more different types of responses than just relaying information like English, right? Absolutely, we need to understand how focusing on one thing at a time and knowing how to switch off of the focused attention onto a more of a daydream mode or a break where we're not in the focused attention. I just went 10 minutes. We're not in focused attention. And also understanding the neuroscience of how children learn, and understanding that some kids are more built essentially for math or more built for language arts, understanding that the brain changes more so than just maturity levels or just the capacity to store information, but also in how information is stored in the brain and which areas. I hope that this conversation has been interesting. I hope it has been helpful. I thank you very much for listening, and I hope I made sense. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.